From the world of politics to the world of business, this is Balance of Power. Live from Washington, D.C.
From Bloomberg's Washington, D.C. studios to our TV and radio audiences worldwide, welcome to Balance of Power. Alongside Joe Matthew, I'm Kaylee Lyons.
Secretary of State Antony Blinken back in the Middle East today after Israeli forces rescue 4 hostages in Gaza. And Benny Gantz resigns from the government. We'll have more this hour with Hagar Chemali, former director for Syria and Lebanon at the National Security Council. And Democratic Congressman Raja Krishnamoorthi of Illinois will join.
French President Emmanuel Macron calls a snap legislative vote in the wake of a surge for far-right parties in parliamentary elections across Europe. Joe Twyman of Deltapoll will join us with more on the global implications.
And former President Donald Trump is interviewed by a New York probation officer who could influence the sentencing for his felony convictions. On this day, the jury begins deliberating in Hunter Biden's criminal trial in Delaware. We'll have the latest on that as well. Kaylee, welcome back. It's great to have you with us again in the nation's capital. That, by the way, that jury in the Hunter Biden trial has called it a night, so we'll have to wait till tomorrow to see what happens next.
Yeah, they'll begin deliberations once again at 9 a.m. And certainly a lot of us here in Washington, including the President of the United States himself, will be paying attention to the ultimate outcome. But of course, we're paying attention to what happened in the Middle East this weekend as well. 4 hostages rescued from central Gaza as part of an Israeli military operation. Hamas says more than 270 people were killed during that operation to rescue those hostages. And today, the UN Security Council adopted a U.S. resolution backing the Gaza ceasefire. U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken returned to the Middle East as part of the U.S.'s attempt to push that ceasefire proposal and had this to say earlier today.
My message to governments throughout the region, to people throughout the region is, if you want a ceasefire, press Hamas to say yes. If you want to alleviate the terrible suffering of Palestinians in Gaza, press Hamas to say yes. If you want to get all the hostages home, press Hamas to say yes.
Joining us now for more is Bloomberg's Dan Flatley, who covers national security for us. So, Dan, is there a feeling on the part of the U.S. as Blinken makes this 8th trip to the Middle East since October 7th that a ceasefire is closer or potentially farther away because of the results of this weekend?
I think we're sort of basically at the same place we've been for the last 2 weeks. There was some, as we've talked about before, some initial hope on a Friday afternoon. Biden came out, talked about the ceasefire agreement, that there could be some movement. I don't know that this weekend's events really change any of that dynamic. I mean, one of the things that I was thinking about was this operation, as impressive as it was from a military standpoint, does not get you really any closer to a diplomatic solution, which is what we need here in order for this ceasefire to move forward. And you heard Secretary of State Antony Blinken there talking about the need to put pressure on Hamas by the other countries in the region. And that is something that so far hasn't worked. So, I don't think we're expecting a breakthrough here, although one could always hope for something like that.
What's the sticking point? We saw the UN Security Council endorse a resolution today. Obviously, the Biden administration has. Hamas says it endorses this in principle, but it must be a permanent ceasefire.
Right.
So who's holding this up?
Well, I think both sides have their incentives here. From the Israeli perspective, obviously, you don't want to commit to something that's going to restrain or curtail your ability to continue to carry out military operations if you feel that that's necessary. And from Hamas's perspective, they want sort of this process to be baked in. They want this to be a permanent ceasefire, for this to lead to the end of Israeli military operations in Gaza. And Israel and Netanyahu, Prime Minister Netanyahu, still feel that the eradication of Hamas has not been achieved, and that needs to happen before any kind of durable ceasefire can be put in place.
Dan, thank you. Bloomberg's Dan Flatley getting us rolling this evening on Balance of Power as Donald Trump holds his first major campaign rally since his guilty verdict in New York. Appearing over the weekend outdoors in 100-degree heat in Las Vegas, the former president making a direct appeal to service workers.
For those hotel workers and people that get tips, you're going to be very happy, because when I get to office, we are going to not charge taxes on tips, people making tips. Those people that have jobs in restaurants, whatever the job may be, a tipping job, we're not going after for taxes anymore.
Joining us now is Bloomberg's Texas bureau chief, Julie Fine, who had an eye on the rally and is watching the campaign for us always. Julie, it's great to have you here. I could talk about some of the more inflammatory rhetoric that the former president used, including the fact that his teleprompter stopped working out there. But for the Bloomberg audience, this is pretty interesting to be going after taxes on tips, knowing that Joe Biden has to bring home that culinary workers union on the Las Vegas Strip to be able to take the state of Nevada. Does this become a real campaign issue?
This is a very big campaign issue. And of course, this is a way to directly appeal to voters and say, this is exactly what I am going to do. However, as you know, there are a lot of steps that will need to be taken for that to actually become a reality. But like you said, I have spent quite a bit of time in Nevada on this campaign. I will tell you that cost of living is top of mind for the voters. So the president going there, which is likely to be one of many trips, the former president, and President Biden has gone there as well, to really try to get those electoral votes in what could be a very close state.
On the subject of President Biden, Julie, his son, of course, has been in trial in Delaware on criminal gun charges. The jury began deliberations today. Will resume again tomorrow. We could potentially have a verdict before Tuesday is out. How should we think through the political ramifications for the president?
Well, first of all, the president, as you know, will be heading to Italy this week. This will be a question for him on the campaign trail. Basically, whatever happens either way, there will be ramifications for the president. However, if he is found guilty, if Hunter Biden is found guilty, this will certainly be with him for some time. Interesting to point out here, Hunter Biden not taking the stand. That was pretty much expected. But again, this jury's still out right now. That happened earlier today. So obviously taking some time to think about this one.
Well, that's for sure. Is this something we should be covering in the same breath, Julie? I'm just trying to get a sense of where we're going here with the former president's legal troubles impacting an active presidential campaign. What does Hunter Biden impact?
Well, I think what will happen here is many Republicans will talk about the problems. Are they apples to apples? Well, that is certainly for voters to decide, but the Democrats certainly will say that is not the case. You're talking about a family member and the former president himself, but certainly something that both sides will be bringing up on the campaign trail.
All right, Bloomberg's Julie Fine, thank you so much. Now, still ahead, we'll be joined by Democratic Congressman Raja Krishnamoorthi of Illinois, ranking member of the China Select Committee, also a member of the House Intelligence Committee, to have more conversation on the events in the Middle East over the weekend. That's next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.
The reality is, though, the only person that matters when it comes to Hamas right now is Yahya Sinwar. And for him, there's not a lot of benefit to agreeing to a ceasefire. And if he doesn't agree to a ceasefire, well, then there's no pressure for Netanyahu to ultimately agree to one either.
That was Jonathan Panikoff, senior fellow at the Atlantic Council, earlier today talking about the potential of a ceasefire agreement between Israel and Hamas, as Secretary of State Antony Blinken is in the Middle East for an 8th time since October 7th now, pushing that proposal. Joining us now with more is Democratic Congressman Raja Krishnamoorthi of Illinois, ranking member of the China Select Committee and a member of the House Oversight and Intelligence Committees. Congressman, thank you so much and welcome back to Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. You sit on the Intelligence Committee, of course, and I'd like to ask you from an intelligence perspective, in the absence of agreeing to a ceasefire, are we going to be able to see Israel bring all of the remaining hostages home after they rescued 4 over the weekend? How many operations would it take to get everyone home, like what we saw Saturday? And are the casualties going to be enough or justifiable if that's the avenue they pursue?
I just don't see them being able to get all the hostages out. I think that we need a ceasefire and hostages deal immediately. I'm very glad that the Security Council voted to basically put in place this 3-part ceasefire plan, where the first phase is the release of hostages and a 6-week ceasefire. along with 600 trucks a day of humanitarian aid. The second phase being continuation of negotiations toward a permanent ceasefire. And then the third phase is reconstruction and governance of Gaza. That's what we should be headed toward, and we need that now more than ever.
Why should we think, Congressman, and maybe you don't, that the UN Security Council vote today will make a difference, as the Biden administration has been largely ignored when it comes to advice for Benjamin Netanyahu recently?
Well, I think that the actual plan is an Israeli plan. The Israelis put that plan on the table. So Hamas really needs to be pressured to accept the terms. And really, there we have the Qataris and the Egyptians and others who can exert leverage. I think at the end of the day, there's just no other alternative than kind of an immediate cessation of hostilities in return for these hostages and humanitarian aid. A continuation of this current conflict grows more and more gruesome by the day, as you can tell.
And it does indeed, and it's great to get your perspective, Congressman, as a member of the Intelligence Committee, but of course you are also ranking member of the China Select Committee. So separately, I'd like to ask you about the visit we just saw from NVIDIA CEO Jensen Huang to Taiwan, referring at one point to Taiwan as a country, as not just someone who is from there, but also someone who is leading a company in a critical sector that the U.S. is actively trying to make sure China cannot be as competitive in. How concerned are you about the relationship that these companies and the people who lead them have to navigate when it comes to Taiwan, which is obviously a hotbed for the semi-industry, and China?
I'm not concerned. Obviously, Jensen is a favorite son of Taiwan, hailing from there. And so he has a certain pride in Taiwan, which is understandable. And Taiwan is a vibrant democracy, as you know. I think at this point, I'm very glad that the current president, William Lai, like his predecessor, Tsai Ing-wen, has adopted a status quo policy. That is, let's not rock the boat. Let's not take provocative actions on either side of the Taiwan Strait to basically send tensions into the stratosphere. And let's instead focus on ways to stabilize the situation and bring more regional stability as well.
Well, it's interesting. Kayleigh mentions Jensen Huang, and he was treated like a hero coming home in a massive stadium wearing the leather jacket and the whole bit, but he wasn't the only one there. Lisa Su was there. We saw the leaders of Qualcomm, Intel, all the big chip makers there at that Computex confab in Taipei. An important moment, Congressman, as we consider the idea of reshoring this industry. At the end of this Congress, should Computex be here in the United States?
Why not? I think that, Jensen Huang and Lisa Su and all that amazing talent shows that we can bring this technology back home to the United States, and that, it makes all the sense in the world for TSMC, the large Taiwanese semiconductor maker, to utilize the Chips and Science Act successfully to invest here in the United States. Of course, we need to do certain things, such as ending double taxation on Taiwanese investment income, which kind of discourages more investment under the Chips and Science Act from Taiwan. I'm glad that we in the House have passed that, and I'm hopeful that we can pass it out of the Senate. But the good news is that the Chips and Science Act and President Biden, under his leadership, has provided an excellent vehicle for attracting tremendous amounts of investment in the semiconductor arena to the United States.
Congressman, you also sit on the Oversight Committee. Your work is not just limited to the China Select Committee. And obviously, Oversight, together with the judiciary, has put forward these contempt articles against the Attorney General Merrick Garland for not providing the audio tapes of President Biden's interview with Special Counsel Hur. It seems that maybe something that you could have to vote on this week after rules marks that up tomorrow. What precedent would it set if this is done, if this passes the House?
It'd be a horrible precedent. I mean, this is ridiculous. I don't remember a time in my 8 years where a White House actually forked over the transcripts that were requested by Congress and then did interviews with Congress with regard to the same subject matter and then was somehow held in contempt for not providing what someone called the audiobook version of those very transcripts. It doesn't make any sense. You don't need those tapes in order to know what happened in those interviews because there were transcripts. And so this is completely a farce. And as you could tell from the other day when we had this little notice hearing in the Oversight Committee, a lot of people are upset about this. I'm going to be voting against it. And I guess it just goes to show you that the Oversight Committee, unfortunately, is not spending its time wisely right now.
Well, I hope that you can maintain decorum in that hearing. I suspect a lot of people will be watching, Congressman. With that said, the chairman of Oversight, and I believe Jim Jordan from the Judiciary Committee also said that it's in fact the tone, it's the inflection, that hearing the conversation is different than reading the conversation. What is your concern about releasing those tapes?
I think that, there could be some accommodation reached maybe with regard to, this or that part of the transcript that might be inaudible or that might require, perhaps greater transparency as to what happened in the hearing room at that point. But to say, I want to hear the audiobook version of the transcript and the transcript alone is not enough, and if you don't provide it to me, you're in contempt, that would set a whole new standard for what is contemptible behavior. And I'm concerned about that, to say the least.
All right, Congressman, we thank you for being with us. Roger Krishnamoorthi of Illinois, we thank you for joining us again on Bloomberg. We'll see you back in Washington. Coming up, a look at the EU elections and French President Emmanuel Macron's call for a surprise parliamentary election following his defeat. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.
This is a serious and weighty decision, but above all, it is an act of trust. Confidence in you, my dear compatriots, in the ability of the French people to make the just choice for themselves and for future generations.
French President Emmanuel Macron yesterday calling for a snap legislative ballot after far-right parties in France and other countries across Europe made gains in parliamentary elections on Sunday. Joining us now with more is Joe Twyman, co-founder and director of Deltapoll, a UK-based polling firm. And Joe, it's great to have you back on Bloomberg TV and radio. How should we be framing this? Europe tilts right or the center holds?
Yes, I think that's the best way to think about it, but certainly a tilt rather than a radical movement. There was certainly a swing to the right, and that is clear. Populist and radical right parties increased their vote share in 21 of the 25 countries. Only Hungary, Denmark, Finland and Sweden saw a reduction in that side of the support on the political spectrum. But the European People's Parliament, a centre-right bloc within the European Parliament, that maintains its position as the largest bloc, but certainly it is the most right-wing European Parliament we have ever seen.
Well, and on that note, Joe, it begs the question of whether this is just the first event in what could turn into a much wider pivot toward the far right, if you will. If we will at some point not just be talking about a tilt, but a full directional change. Do you see that happening? Is this an indication of that?
I think it certainly shows the potential. We have previously seen in the Netherlands, for instance, Geert Wilders becoming the leader of the largest party after the elections in that country, and in Italy, a very successful right-wing success there. I think the results in France were particularly interesting, with National Rally, Marine Le Pen's party, finishing first and by some distance, 30% of the vote versus 15% of the vote for President Emmanuel Macron's Renew party. But on the other side, when you look at Germany, the Alternative for Deutschland party, AfD, they came second, and again by some distance, 16% to 30% for the opposition centre-right CDU party. So things in the European Parliament tend to move rather slowly in terms of evolution. It's more evolution than revolution, certainly. But I think the trend is certainly one that is continuing, and in the UK as well, where we no longer get to vote in European Parliament elections.
Well, why is Emmanuel Macron going for this snap election? Why take on a gamble like that?
Well, it's a very good question, and perhaps it's context for American viewers. Snap election really means that. It's just 3 weeks until the election is to take place, which is around about the same time as the British election as well. And the answer is complicated, but essentially it is seen by many as an attempt to do what he can to fight against the right wing of the French political spectrum in the form of National Rally. And there are hopes that he will be able, within Macron's team, that he will be able to form some kind of grand coalition of the centre and the left to fight against National Rally in these legislative elections. But there's no doubt that it is a big gamble, and whether the kind of discussions and quite frankly disagreements that would need to take place in order to form that kind of coalition could occur in 3 weeks is very much a question that's up in the air.
Well, Joe, since you raised the UK election on July 4th and our final moment with you, is that not going to buck the trend of what we really saw take place over this weekend, and that it's the Conservatives that look like they are likely to lose and potentially lose big?
Certainly, the polling at the moment suggests a big loss for the Conservatives. There are still the election is not until the 4th of July, and so we still do have a few weeks remaining. But certainly, on current trends, it's looking very bad for the centre-right Conservatives. But the centre-left Labour Party are certainly improving their position as the campaign continues. Not by a massive amount, but certainly enough to give them confidence. But there is a question about the more radical right Reform Party, which has really been the success story in the polls in this country since the turn of the year. The impact that they can have in individual constituencies and with the national vote could make things very interesting for the Conservatives longer term.
All right, Joe Twyman of Deltapoll, thank you so much for joining us. And Joe, also very interesting to consider if we look back many years ago to the Brexit vote and the election of Donald Trump that happened just a few months later. It does beg the question of what we've seen happen in Europe this weekend and how that might read through to what we see here in the U.S. in November.
That's for sure. Not to mention shades of Ukraine impacting both sides of the ocean here, it seems.
A very good point. Well, coming up, we will be talking not about Ukraine, but another geopolitical conflict. Israeli forces rescuing 4 hostages in Gaza over the weekend, but Benny Gantz resigns from the government over Netanyahu's handling of the war. We'll have more next with Hagar Chemali, formerly of the National Security Council, next on Bloomberg TV and radio.
Look, I think this is a critical moment because we see the possibility, we see the prospect of an immediate ceasefire, of getting all the hostages home, of getting on the path to a durable resolution to the conflict in Gaza.
Secretary of State Antony Blinken, during his now 8th visit to the Middle East, arriving today. Joining us is Hagar Chemali, the founder, CEO of Greenwich Media Strategies and former director for Syria and Lebanon at the White House National Security Council. Hagar, welcome back. It's great to see you. I keep asking the same question and can't seem to get an answer. If both parties, Israel and Hamas, have signed off on this deal, the United States presenting it here today, the UN Security Council endorsing it with that vote, what is the holdup?
Well, we're not sure about Hamas just yet. I mean, from what I've heard, it's Israel which has supported the deal. Hamas is trying to hang on to power. This is their only way. They know that they are at the end. Their military capabilities have been really significantly decimated. President Biden himself said that. And that's their number one goal, is to try and figure out a way. And so you see them trying to play these dirty games of, whatever machinations they can make to stay in power. But the thing is that as time is wearing on, pressure even on Hamas and pressure even within Gaza is increasing. Gazans are becoming increasingly vocal about how angry they are that they are finding themselves in harm's way because of Hamas. Sometimes there's a major information war here that sometimes occasionally it feels like Hamas is winning in terms of whether the extent to which people realize how much is Hamas's fault, how much it is that they are in the way of a ceasefire. But the fact is what you're seeing now is with every week that passes, you're seeing more the ceasefire plan changing, adapting, giving more to the Palestinian side. Israel saying we're ready to do this. You see the G7 last week came out behind it. Now you have the UN Security Council just passed a resolution today for a ceasefire. And now you also have political movement inside Israel that threatens Netanyahu's grip on power, which also helps push for a ceasefire. So I see all these signs that we're finally close to getting to something, but Hamas is the one that finally has to wake up and see that they have no future anyway.
Well, it's interesting to consider how the events of this weekend may influence that. This is something we spoke to Jonathan Panikoff of the Atlantic Council about earlier today, this rescue operation that did result in the saving of 4 Israeli hostages, but also resulted in the deaths of nearly 300 Palestinians, according to Hamas. And Panikoff says that could add a complication. Take a listen.
I do think it certainly creates a situation where Sinwar now has an excuse again through propaganda of saying how many were killed to say, no, there's no reason for me to negotiate. Look what Israel is doing. And that can complicate things right now.
Hagar, I wonder what you think of that, this idea that we saw a large number of casualties as the result of getting those hostages rescued. Does that actually make a ceasefire farther out of reach than it was before?
Well, so to answer your question backwards, I don't think it makes it harder to obtain, because every single week there's something that arguably could be used as an excuse for the ceasefire to not go through, right? You had only 2 weeks ago was the situation in Rafah, where an airstrike against 2 Hamas militants ended up igniting that fire that killed somewhere around 40 Palestinians. And I would take issue, by the way, with the number of Palestinians who were killed. First of all, it's numbers coming from Hamas. So we don't know the actual numbers. And second of all, we don't know how many were militants. We know that of the 2 convoys that had gone to Septus to rescue the hostages, one of them came under intense fire and were fighting militants for a while. They almost didn't make it out safely. So you're going to have a number of them that are militants. Now, and let's say you take the number in between Israel, what Israel says, which is under 100, and the Palestinians who say that it's 274. And then you have a number of militants. However you look at it, all of this is part of an information war on the part of Hamas. They're a terrorist organization at the end of the day. It's not like dealing with any state or government. And so they're going to use anything they can to try and increase their position of power in negotiations. But at the end of the day, they know more than anybody, and the U.S. government put this out there, that their military capabilities and certainly governing capabilities are getting worse by the day. Their prospects are getting worse the longer this war goes on. They're trying. That's why they're harping so heavily on this information war. To try, the moment the hostages are rescued, is to go out and say, "Oh, but you know what? Let's do this math of how many lives are equal to 1 Israeli." And you see a lot of social media hyping that up. Of course, all of this to say, you're going to have these type of big events every week, and I don't see it undermining ceasefire talks. At the end of the day, it's about how weak Hamas will feel. That's when they genuinely feel weak, is when they'll finally give in to some kind of negotiation, because that'll be their only way of survival.
When does Israel open a war against Hezbollah?
Oof. Okay, so listen, the timing that you have to look for is this summer. If it's going to happen, it's going to be this summer before September. And the reason I say that is that you have tens of thousands of Israelis who've been displaced from the north of Israel elsewhere. And there's a lot of pressure on the Netanyahu government right now that for them, because they want to return and they want their kids to go back to school in September. And things are heating up in general. You're seeing a lot of rhetoric inside the Netanyahu administration about finishing Hezbollah off once and for all and saying, we're not going to take this anymore. You can't threaten our people in the north. They have to get back to their lives. That said, if you have all these moving parts, and you do have all these moving parts for a potential ceasefire, more and more countries jumping on board, Israel, the Israeli government adapting and making that ceasefire proposal more favorable to the Hamas side. When you have all those moving parts, a potential normalization deal, if that were to happen, then I wouldn't worry about anything happening with Hezbollah, because Hezbollah is only pursuing strikes to show that it's doing something at all. And that said, that's not the Israeli government's only going to accept it for so long. If you have something winding down in Gaza, it frees the Israeli military up to pursue something against Hezbollah. But again, if it's a ceasefire, then that's likely to dissipate. Though those tensions will calm down. If they don't calm down and you don't have a ceasefire, then I would expect things to ramp up July, August timeframe before September to send a message to Hezbollah that we want our people to go back. You better stop bothering them.
Okay, so it could be potentially something that happens in short order, if at all. Hagar, you mentioned there a few times the pressure within the Netanyahu government, and certainly you saw that government shrinking, at least in some way. The war cabinet got smaller after Benny Gantz this weekend decided he was out. He disagrees too much with Benjamin Netanyahu on the conduct of this war, and also the idea that there needs to be an end plan in place, what that ultimately will look like. He was a more moderate voice in this coalition government, Hagar. There's much more far-right influence potentially left in his wake. How should we think about the consequence of that?
So it's fascinating. So because the war cabinet was created really in order to assemble more centrist, more expert voices to help forge a path forward and a strategy related to this war. Notably, the far-right ministers of Netanyahu's government are not part of the war cabinet. Now, that doesn't mean, like you said, these far-right voices are certainly going to be able to fill up a vacuum in terms of Netanyahu's own administration. But at the end of the day, Netanyahu is caught between a rock and a hard place, between several rocks and several hard places, because on one hand, he's absolutely pursuing decisions with a political goal in mind. Politics for him and staying in office is a question of survival. He has been facing major corruption investigations. If he is out of office, then those corruption investigations are going to catch up with him, and those cases are going to move forward. Whereas while he's in office, he finds ways to shield himself. He has tried to pursue all these judicial overhaul efforts that were the butt of a lot of drama last year, and obviously the reason for a lot of protests last year before the conflict broke out. So you have that rock and hard place, and that Netanyahu wants to stay in office, but at the same time he's facing pressure from the hostage families to accept a ceasefire, to get the hostages released, because even with the amazing news of the 4 hostages released now, we can see very clearly from the numbers that you get the greatest number of hostages released from these deals. Rescuing them is a very difficult, very arduous effort that is extremely risky and dangerous. And they've only rescued, I believe, 7 so far since the beginning, since October 7. And whereas you have around 120 more or less left in Gaza. So he's facing that pressure too, but he knows that the far right won't accept a ceasefire. All that said, these are all things that will crumble. Now, the fact that Benny Gantz has now left, and Benny Gantz with the latest polls shows that he has a majority over Netanyahu, and he's calling for elections, and we know how volatile things are in Israel generally. No, on a normal day, the politics are very volatile. I would expect those elections to take place at some point this year. But Netanyahu, he feels like he's in this crunch, and I just don't know that he can hang on that much longer.
All right, Hagar, always great to have you. Thank you so much for joining us. Hagar Chemali, founder and CEO of Greenwich Media Strategies and former director for Syria and Lebanon at the National Security Council. Coming up, the jury in Hunter Biden's gun trial has been dismissed today after beginning deliberations. They'll be back tomorrow, and we'll have more with our political panel on what implications that may have. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.
This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. I'm Joe Matthew alongside Kaylee Lyons. Thanks for joining us. The jury in Hunter Biden's gun trial deliberated today without reaching a verdict. We'll return tomorrow morning as we now assemble our political panel. Rick Davis is back with us, Stonecourt Capital, and Jeanne, Zaino, political science professor at Iona University, senior democracy fellow with the Center for the Study of the Presidency and Congress. They are both Bloomberg Politics contributors. Great to see both of you and have you back together again. Jeanne, are you on pins and needles over this Hunter Biden verdict? We just went through the process here with Donald Trump, but of course Hunter Biden isn't running for president.
That's right. But he is the first child of a sitting president to face criminal prosecution. So it is a big deal. And the fact that we could get a verdict as early as tomorrow, I think a lot of us are watching it very, very closely. He is facing 25 years in jail if he's convicted. So it is a very big deal. And we know it's a big deal to the family. We've seen the First Lady back and forth from Europe, more members of the family in the courthouse today than any day of the trial. So a very big and very personal issue for the Bidens.
So certainly has personal implications, Rick, but also potentially political ones, because he's not just the son of a sitting president. He's the son of a president who is seeking re-election. How do you see this playing for President Biden? On the one hand, he has faced a lot of criticism, whether it's warranted or not, for not stepping in the prosecutions of Donald Trump. So if he doesn't intervene himself in his son's case, potentially that argument would lose some more at least perceived credibility. How do you see this shaking out ultimately, if he's guilty or not?
Yeah, look, I mean, obviously, if he's guilty, we have something to compare it to, right? We just saw politically for the last 10 days what's happened to a former president when he's been convicted. And it actually hasn't had that big a deal, big impact. It's had on the margin. And of course, we have such a close race, the margins matter. And we're seeing more and more polling data showing Joe Biden ticking up a little bit in these key 6 or 7 targeted states. So maybe it does have a outcome base. But afterwards, most people were like, well, he got convicted, 34 counts. Wow. We'll see what happens with the sentencing, which will be right before the Republican convention. So I would imagine Hunter Biden would get the same treatment, right? In other words, he's going to get either off or convicted. And if he's acquitted, I think this is much to do about nothing. And if he's convicted, I think he gets kind of the same Joe Biden gets the same kind of treatment, that Donald Trump got, which was maybe there's a little bit of credibility problems. But I think the key thing is what you said, which is he hasn't intervened and he shouldn't intervene. And if he doesn't intervene, should he get a little bit of credit for that from the electorate, especially his own voters who've migrated to Trump?
Is there a counterintuitive result here potentially, Jeanne, in which President Biden, who has been very loyal to his son here and is set by his side, the whole family, many different members of the family were with Hunter Biden in court, which is something that Donald Trump did not enjoy, with the exception of his 2 sons. In this case, his 2 eldest sons. Is there something for standing by your family member in this case?
Yeah, I think there is. And, what I've been watching is the Trump rhetoric on the Hunter Biden trial. And I think one thing to note is that he has not been attacking Hunter Biden. He has been talking about addiction. He talked on Fox News with Sean Hannity the other day about this case, and he talked about it in the context of his own brother who died of alcoholism. So he has taken a hands-off approach, if you will. We've heard that from Republicans who before that were attacking Hunter Biden. So I think they realize what the polls seem to indicate on this case, which is that people see this as a personal, really, really difficult issue for so many families who have faced addiction. And very few of us do not, are in a position where we've never encountered it. And if Donald Trump is recognizing that, I think politically voters are not going to think much about this as they go to the polls.
I wonder if they think more about not paying your taxes, though. Rick, it's worth pointing out, it is not just this case that Hunter Biden is facing. In September, he will be on trial in California for a number of tax-related crimes that he's been indicted of, especially considering the timing of that, September, with an outcome potentially that month or October, getting closer and closer to the election. Is that actually the case the president needs to worry more about?
Yeah, I think so. Timing-wise, more people will be paying attention to what's going on in the presidential race. And that means these tangential issues like Hunter Biden and the cases against Donald Trump, too, would get more attention. What's ironic here, I think, is that you had all these early cases against Donald Trump that now look like they've all been kicked off into, post-election, other than the convictions that he's already sustaining. And here Hunter Biden's going to be the guy everyone's going to be talking about in September and October, as you point out. So, look, it's hard to tell. It's such new turf for anybody like me who's been a political junkie for 40 years that you don't normally have this kind of a conversation about presidents and sons of presidents being convicted. As Jeanne said, this is the first time. So I really don't know if it's going to have a salient impact politically. And when it does, we won't be surprised. But if it's not, I think that'll be just more that we learn about the future of politics, which is, people see these legal problems as separate from political problems.
If you're Joe Biden, though, you're the president, and you're going to the G7 this week. Jeanne coming off a visit to Normandy in which she had a couple of very high-profile speeches. Does that mean an automatic win in the end for Joe Biden this week as Donald Trump, we'll talk about this a little more later, meets with his probation officer?
Yeah, I mean, this is where the team wants to be, the Biden campaign. They want him to be doing his job, the job of the president, meeting foreign leaders, protecting the United States, talking about democracy. Certainly nobody wants their candidate talking to a probation officer. That said, we saw the polls. We've had 3 big polls since the conviction, and it has moved the numbers very, very little. I mean, do the margins matter in this case? Absolutely. But it is not like people have been fleeing from Donald Trump. Quite the contrary. The polls have remained relatively stable, and he's raised an awful lot of money. So the conviction, and I think the probation discussion today, is not going to have much impact. Joe Biden needs to be in the U.S. as soon as he's able, talking about the economy, the economy, the economy. There was a great story in Bloomberg today about the cost of owning a home up 24%. That is the kind of thing that's killing Joe Biden at the polls that they need to address.
All right, Jeanne and Rick are going to be sticking with us. Our political panel will be back for more on Donald Trump, not just that probation meeting that happened today, but of course after a rally in Las Vegas over the weekend in which he floated the idea of not taxing tipped income rather. We'll have more next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.
Those J6 warriors, they were warriors, but they were really more than anything else. They're victims of what happened. All they were doing is protesting a rigged election. That's what they were doing.
That was Donald Trump at a rally in Las Vegas over the weekend. Back with us now for final thoughts, our political panel, Rick Davis of Stonecourt Capital and Jeanne Zaino, political science professor at Iona University and senior democracy fellow with the Center for the Study of the Presidency and Congress. Rick, it was not just January 6 warriors that Trump was talking about in Vegas this weekend at an incredibly hot rally, but also the idea of not taxing tips. In a state in which culinary hospitality workers are so important, is that an argument, whether or not he can do it without Congress, something that could win him a crucial state?
Yeah, first of all, there's probably no way to do it without Congress. But secondarily, I think it's this whole idea of some level of discipline at a Trump rally where he's actually talking about tax policy. Now, of course, he talks about, sinking ships and shark attacks and things like that, too. So, you get what you get at a Trump rally. But he was talking also about making some of his tax cuts permanent that he had done in his first term. I think it's actually, especially, in a place like Nevada, where you have the culinary workers who make up such a big part of the economy there, to do that, I thought was pretty nimble. And kudos to the Trump policy guys who wrote it into the speech for him that, putting that on. And every Democrat I've seen talking about today was very defensive about, we've had policies like that in the past, and we couldn't get Congress to pass them. And I think, putting the Democrats on the defense like that is, I think, a really good tactic, even though 100 degrees in Nevada is crazy.
All right, I'm not going to ask you if you'd rather stay in the boat, the sinking boat with the battery, or jump in the water with the sharks. That was the dynamic and the decision laid out there by Donald Trump at the podium. But, Jeanne, this is an opportunity to make tax policy an issue on the campaign trail. Does Joe Biden dig into this, knowing that all of this is leading to an argument over making the 2017 Trump tax cuts permanent?
Yeah, I think we're going to have that debate. They're going to be fighting it out. You know, there is going to be a large school of people who say carve-outs like this are not the way to go. And of course, to Rick's point, you don't probably need Congress. You do need Congress. So it's a heck of a promise to make when he can't deliver on it. But the reality is that we're going to be fighting this out in 2025 as we fight out about what happens with the Trump tax cuts. And I think Joe Biden wants to talk about this. It's a major issue that he's talked about taxing billionaires and protecting the middle class.
Stay tuned for a lot more on that. Jeanne, Zaino, and Rick Davis, thanks for a great conversation. Our signature panel here on Balance of Power. I'd stay in the boat. Stay in the boat? Always stay in the boat.
I've heard always stay in the boat, but I've also heard just punch the shark in the nose and it goes away. So
I'm staying in the boat.
I guess it depends on if it's one shark or many.
She's jumping in with the sharks. Check out the Washington Edition newsletter on the terminal and online.
Thanks for joining us back here on Balance of Power. We'll be back here tomorrow staying on dry land, so make sure to tune in then. This is Bloomberg TV and Radio.